As the summer begins to heat up, the bizarre dynamics of this wild housing market become more apparent. If someone has shown a group of housing experts a chart of current interest rates, their prediction would differ immensely from the reality that has unfolded over the past 3 months. In January of 2021, the average 30-year mortgage was 2.65%. Now, 2.5 years later, the rate is more than 2 times higher, coming in at 6.92% as I record this video. Yet, despite the incredible rise, home prices are not cooling. This number gets even worse when we look at it through the prism of monthly payments. It can easily be argued that today, as we speak, housing in America is at its most unaffordable level ever. When we look at a chart of average monthly payments, you can see that today we find ourselves in unknown territory. The typical buyer in the United States is now paying over $2,600 a month, far higher than the numbers last year, despite the fact that last year median prices were around the same amount. Many are now calling this an affordability crisis. How can a typical young family afford to buy their first home when prices have jumped over 50% in many areas and monthly payments have more than doubled since 2020? We can look at all kinds of charts, including new listings, median prices, active prices, the list goes on, but no one has really dived deep into understanding just how unaffordable and unfair today's market really is. You hear about people back in the 80s who were buying homes with 14% mortgages, and experts often compare today's rates with those and say things aren't really as bad as they seem. The common argument is that while yes, we have enjoyed a long period of somewhat affordable housing and extremely low interest rates, that period was not normal, and the fair comparison would be to look at this, a normal interest rate environment in the years that followed the 1970s all the way up until the 2000s bubble. And if you put emotions to the side, you can understand that this may just be a fair argument. The 30-year interest rate at one point in the early 80s did in fact reach 18%, and for people who were buying at the time, this must have been a miserable experience. But is it comparable to today's environment? I wanted to compare affordability throughout the decades following the 1970s, and I decided to make my own chart that would finally put to bed this debate of how bad it really was. Now, I'm not a data scientist, nor do I claim that this method of measuring affordability is the correct way to do it, but I do believe that it does provide a relatively fair picture of what's going on using reliable data from various government sources. There are a few assumptions I'm going to make, but ultimately, as you will see, this chart is going to give you a new perspective on today's market, understanding how damaged it is compared to decades in the past. We know that at the end of the day, when you're looking at the housing market, what you should be investigating is how much money you make versus how much money you spend on a monthly basis. Now, because the vast majority of people purchase a home using a mortgage, what you really should be looking at is how much money you make monthly versus what your typical mortgage payment is. So without spending even more time explaining the methodology and boring you to death, I'll try to hurry this up. I essentially took the median household income from every year going back to the early 70s and then looked at how much of that monthly gross income would be needed to pay for a typical mortgage payment adjusted for that year's median price and that year's average interest rate. I also included the typical payment for taxes, insurance, and assumed a 15% down payment. On top of that, I also assumed that the typical home buyer makes about 15% more than the median household income, as home buyers are usually better off than the average American. And what I got was this. At the end of the day, this is essentially a chart that shows what percentage of a typical American income would be spent on a normal American mortgage payment. And what you see is that during the early 80s, we did in fact have an affordability crisis worse than what is happening today. For example, in 1982, the typical household income was $22,000 a year, while a medium home cost $48,000. Now, that year, the average 30-year interest rate was around 16.5%, which means that the typical payment was around $658. That is 36% of the median income after the 15% adjustment I talked about earlier. That is the highest ratio in modern American history. And if you look back into the archives during 1982, you can see there are many articles showcasing the frozen market. Things were very similar to what is happening today. People simply refused to buy or list in that infamous year. This article shows that annual sales fell to the lowest level since the government began tracking stats in 1963. Now, following 1982, this number went down for decades, reaching equilibrium around the 22% mark. It would stay there for decades to come. Even during the 2008 bubble, affordability never really jumped up in a way that rivaled today's numbers or the ones in the 1980s. In fact, after the crash, we saw affordability reach record low numbers. In the months following the '08 recession, this ratio fell as low as 20% and then quietly rose up right before interest rate hikes following 2020. It was at this point here where we reached an all-time low in this ratio, hitting 19.73%. But just as things looked amazing, the tide quickly turned with the Fed battling sky-high inflation. Affordability got heavily damaged, rising to levels we had not seen in decades, rivaling 1982. Today we can see that the ratio stands at 32%, close to that 82 number, but still a few points below it. The median household income today with that 15% adjustment is around $78,000 and the median house is around $335,000. With the way things have been going this year, we could see that record shattered, but ultimately based on history, it won't get much worse than this, and mean reversion is something that will likely happen over the next 2 years. There is no doubt that today's market is essentially broken. If we try to look into the future, we see that some incredibly disturbing developments are likely to happen by the end of the summer. Now, before I reveal them, please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button if you're enjoying the content thus far. Every like is fuel for the algorithm to push this video, and I would greatly appreciate it if you took just 2 seconds to help me out. Now, back to what I was saying. We saw last year that once rates hit 7%, what happens usually is that buyers freeze and the market grinds to a complete halt. Inventory then slowly trickles in as the supply begins to move up. This is how we got that large dip in national prices that started last summer but quickly faded once interest rates softened. Even a small move to the downside changes things immensely. We witnessed how even at 6%, marginal buyers already moved to jump in. For some odd reason, the 7% mark seems to be the breaking point, and even small dips from here cause buyers to appear. Now, as we move down to the 5% level, this is where buyers go crazy. There is no doubt that many people are on the sidelines strictly due to interest rates, and once they see that 5% mark breached, they all jump back in and all hell breaks loose. That pent-up demand of all those waiting on the sidelines gets unleashed, and what you have is a frenzy. At the 4% mark, supply and demand goes off the charts, and this market psychology has to be impacting the decisions the Fed is making in regards to regulating inflation. We know that they have openly stated that the market was in a bubble and normalization was required, but today they find themselves at a crossroads. Many are calling for a pause in rate hikes, which would mean that mortgage rates would most likely pause here as well. In the future, the market would be headed towards a disaster. As we just explained, even if the Fed moved the rate down just 1%, that would unleash a huge wave of buyers off the sidelines, and couple this with almost record low inventory, the situation would be catastrophic. If you think prices are high now, the market would get exponentially worse if for some reason the Fed decided to cut rates soon. This is why I don't see how Powell can relax from here. He probably knows that he needs to end this wild speculation, and continuing to push from here is likely his only option. Affordability simply needs to improve, and the only way to do that is by reducing prices or reducing interest. But going off what I said earlier, the Federal Reserve simply cannot reduce rates without significantly increasing prices. Therefore, they only have one option, and it's to raise the rate until the market breaks and prices fall. They saw what happened last year, and this type of decline needs to continue if there is any hope of normalization happening in the next few years. As I explained in my last video, it's going to be very tough for prices to fall this summer as the inventory situation is just too tight for any type of price reduction. In fact, the RedFin numbers show that new listings have hit their lowest level of any early June on record, limiting home sales and keeping prices afloat. This is the summer buying season, and we're getting numbers worse than 2020, which is creating a perfect storm of demand with incredibly low supply. With so few homes on the market, every single point in the interest rate matters. The environment is highly sensitive to any and all changes in this magical number, and without continued pressure from the Federal Reserve, all their hard work of reducing inflation over the past year can be undone with one wrong decision. Essentially, the next year comes down to this guy, and where he pushes the overnight rate will decide how or if this market has any chance of rapid cooling. Thank you guys for watching. As always, please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments below what type of rate you're getting quoted in your local market.